afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Miao, ADB staff working in SDCC Energy Group. I'm also co-chair of the Track 1, and thank you for participation. National determine the contribution at the heart of the Paris agreements and achievements of the limiting warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Innovative technologies and business models are needed by DMCs to facilitate and expedite transition, and infrastructure investment must be future-proofed regarding rapid technical evolution and climate change. ADB is organizing a thematic track 1 on enhancing NDC and roadmap in coming 3 days of ASAF. First, let me invite Dr. Yongping Zhai to address welcome and the opening remarks. Dr. Zhai has been working on energy development in Asia and Africa for more than 25 years. He is currently the chief of the energy sector group of ADB, in charge of overall energy policy coordination and technical support to ADB energy sector operation. He is also in charge of the developing energy sector knowledge work for ADB. Ms. Zhai, please.
Thank you, Jim Miao, for the kind introduction. I also hope that our co-moderator, Ms. Preeti, will join us soon. In waiting for our moderator to be back on her seat, and I will start welcoming remarks in behalf of Asian Development Bank. Actually, I was working in Africa before. So in behalf of ADB, I welcome you all to join this session as just described by Jim Miao. I think this session is very, very important and timely. We are honored to have Mr. John Merton, COP26 envoy from the UK government, and Mr. Hongpeng Liu, Director of Energy Division from UNESCAP, joining us, and other speakers, very distinguished panel and speakers for this session. I would like to briefly mention, since last 2 weeks, actually, Hongpeng actually reminded me that United Nations has published the latest progress report on SDG 7, as far as we are concerned. When I look at the number of people without access to electricity, I noted down it's 200 million. It's a sharp improvement compared to last version. That was in my last version was 350 million. And when I look at these numbers, I realize that renewable energy and off-grid distributed solutions have contributed a lot to this improvement. But on the other hand, I looked at the other number of SDG 7, that is people without access to clean cooking. That's an alarming number, 1.8 billion as latest number. If we look at these two numbers, and considering that we are 10 years away from 2030, I think that Asia is more or less on track for achieving electrification 100% 2030, but we are quite far from achieving by 2030 universal access for clean access to cooking. This is a big issue. And on the other hand, I attended yesterday one session on the sustainable cooling, and there I realized that there are about 1 billion around the world that people who need basic cooling for not only for human thermal comfort, it's actually for necessary cooling for health and for other basic services. And in Asia, there's 600 million people without necessary cooling. So I think that's, for that matter, also we are quite far away from achieving universal access. With that in the background, we have this nationally determined target, NDC contribution, and whether we are able, first of all, whether we are able to achieve what our country is committed, that's one question. The other question is whether these targets themselves are adequate, sufficient, considering the gaps I've just mentioned in terms of clean cooking and sustainable cooling, And also, even for electrification, there's some way to go as well, because electrification is not just providing lighting, it's also providing somehow in-depth electrification. Then you have to able to support cooling. So that's and productive use of electricity. So in that regard, I think if we want to achieve by 2030 what is stated in SDG-7 for us and Paris Agreement for containing the temperature rise, and for ADB we have our own strategy 2030. I think unless we make progress in technologies, in applying new technologies, we are not able to meet this target. So the question for us is whether by looking at different options, technology options, there is a chance for us to achieve 2030 and or bring back our countries on track in achieving those targets. And this is a big question I want to actually pose for this session and the following sessions during the next 3 days. This technology, new technologies, innovations are very important for us to bring these countries ourselves back on track. To give you a little bit update on ADB, what ADB does in these years and coming years, our lending to energy sector is about $5 billion per year. And if I look at this $5 billion, 50% of this $5 billion is in renewable energy and energy efficiency, so broadly defined as clean energy. So very often people ask why ADB is not 100% financing clean energy. How about the 50%? Let me clarify that the other 50% of our 5 billion lending every year is for transmission, distribution, smart grid, energy storage, all these things that would be necessary to integrate renewable energy. So moving forward, what I see the trend would be that ADB would continue to be very active supporting transmission, distribution, and applying smart components, even energy storage, to make sure that we can integrate more and more renewable energy. But for the financing of renewable energy per se, ADB's financing is only a fraction of the requirement. We are counting on many development partners. We have UK government here, we have UNISCAP as a partner, but I think largely the funding should come from private sector. So when we discuss our roadmap to achieving 2030 goals, technology is one set of important issues, and the other set of important issue is mobilizing stakeholders, including development partners and private sector companies. So in this whole week of ASEF, you will see combination of these discussions on technologies, and also how do we engage with private sector. So that's what I wanted to share as opening remarks as a background for you to further debate and provide your side of perspective. I would like to thank you again for joining us. And this is an online discussion. I know there are many people online, so I take this chance to thank all those people, or participants joining us online. Thank you very much. Some are in very deep, late hours in the US, for example, and for Europe now it's okay, but I understand different time zones have different constraints. I thank you all for your effort in joining this discussion and looking forward to a very productive discussion during this panel. Thank you very much. I hand over to moderator. I'm not sure whether Preeti is back, but Jim Miao can take over next. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Zhai.
Thank you. Jin Miao, I'm back. Technology has worked for me eventually. And thank you, Yongping. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. As the chief architect of the Asia Clean Energy Forum, you've really made a milestone for ADB in getting us virtual for this large congregation of researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So thank you for ensuring that ASEF takes place virtually. And I understand you have to go to another session as the chief organizer. So let me take over from here and introduce our scene-setting speaker, Mr. Hong Peng Liu. Mr. Hong Peng Liu is the Director of Energy at the UN Economic and Social Commission for the Asia and the Pacific, UNSCAP. And he is steering their work on energy cooperation and integration in this region with a focus on SDG-7. He has over 30 years of experience, having worked with the government of People's Republic of China before joining ESCAP. So over to you, Mr. Liu, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pretty. Thanks for the good word. And I think Mr. Jai already set up a very good kind of framework for the discussion for this afternoon. And especially he mentioned about how to just achieve the goals of sustainable energy development, and whether the existing target and the goals are adequate or sufficient, and how we just meet our commitment for the nationally determined contributions. I think those are very important questions. So I just want to share about what we think this kind of NDCs and through this kind of development of energy roadmaps at the national and the regional level. So if I just share these slides, we actually think currently the NDCs under the existing commitment, if even fully implemented, so it would lead to warming 2.9 degrees centigrade. It's even not to reach the 2 degrees centigrade, and of course not the 1.5 degrees centigrade. And also according to the IPCC, this kind of CO2 emission need to decline in 45% from 2010 level by 2030, and 100% from 2010 level by 2050. So in that case, we can reach the global warming, minimize, control this under this 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if you look at the global progress for climate action, so I think our distinguished speaker later, Mr. John Martin, will just mention how this progress is going, but still we are far away. The 1.5 degrees centigrade is on the brink of becoming impossible. Especially based on the current commitment, the emissions in 2030 will be 56 gigatons of CO2 by 2030. And also to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, that is a really big challenge. And every day we delay, so the steeper and more difficult to cut become, this kind of greenhouse gas emissions. And what we are doing in Asia Pacific, what is the progress in the climate change action? If you look at the Asia Pacific, especially this region, the source about half of the global greenhouse gas emission. And the progress for the Asian Pacific has a great potential. It's moving, but it's a lot of space to improve. And also some countries even working very hard, but only to achieve the unconditional target of the NDCs. So that is not enough. And we need stronger and scale up the NDCs. At the same time, if you look at the Asia Pacific, this is a region where have the rapid growth of economy and also the population urbanization. It needs more energy supply. Like Yongping mentioned, we just did the SDG-7 review for this year. We still have about 200 million population without access to electricity, 1.8 billion people without access to clean cooking in Asian Pacific. So how to meet the demand at the same time, and how to maintain our commitment for the reduce of greenhouse gas emission. So how to develop a kind of a national roadmap which achieves both the Sustainable Development Goal 7 on sustainable and clean energy, at the same time also to deliver these NDCs under the Paris Agreement. And that's a big challenge for all the government and also the countries from this region. And if you look at these two, the NDCs implementation and also to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 7. So that's really you need a kind of integrated approach. If you see the SDG 7, which has the 3 targets, one is about the universal access. And secondly, it's about the share of renewable energy increased substantially. And third one is, to double the level of energy efficiency. If you look at all these 3 targets, that's related to NDC closely. All the NDCs based on this, mitigation and based on this energy sector's action. So the integrated approach to 2030 energy transition, that's really need also integrated thinking, integrated, the different sectors. The approach should be the sustainable economic growth based on this development of a national economy and also the population increase and also the urbanization development. And also should at the aim to maximize the energy security. This is also a challenge for many countries in this region. At the same time, to identify the least cost options to achieve the target of SDG 7, also achieve the target of the NDCs. So I think the different kind of technologies and the policies needed to development. But how we do this? And in 2018, ESCAP, we did one study which mainly focused on energy transition pathways for Asia and Pacific. That was a background study for the Ministerial Forum for Asia and Pacific to talk about the sustainable development and also 2030 agenda. At the end of that ministerial conference, the ministerial declaration actually mandated ESCAP to develop a kind of tool for the integrating planning of energy policies and to support the member countries. So later on, we just developed the tool we called the National Expert SDG tool for energy planning. So it's in a way acronym is the next step. So this is a kind of analytical tool to compare different scenarios to achieve the SDG 7 and the NDCs. And this is, we think this scenario analysis will provide a quantified analysis for the decision makers to compare different solutions. And the minimum all scenario will, achieve this universal access to electricity and the universal access to clean cooking fuels by 2030. And also increasing the share of renewables in the energy mix and double the rate of energy efficiency, and also finally achieving the unconditional target of NDCs. So based on this scenario analysis, we also have this kind of a comparison with the business as usual, SDG 7 and the NDCs. So the additional scenario actually compared this and then to provide a different kind of policy recommendations. For example, if you look at this, this is one country. We did Indonesia as an example. Identify the energy and the emissions through this kind of energy efficiency technologies. How much energy savings can contribute from different sectors, and also how much is the cost for this kind of technology switch. At the same time, we also compare the levelized cost of electricity generation from different kind of technologies. But sorry, this is a little bit smaller for this chart. But if you see from the left hand, it's the cheapest kind of technology. To the right hand is the most expensive one. And then with the different kind of technology, how much investment you need. And also this is emission scenarios based on the business as usual, and also based on SDG 7, based on this NDCs. I can see SDG 7, there's gaps between the existing national energy strategy business as usual, and there's also much more challenging, much more gaps between this SDG7 target and the NDCs. So after this scenario analysis, when we develop the roadmap, the most important part is the policy recommendations. So based on these scenarios, how you include these policy recommendations to the policymakers and how to achieve this kind of target by SDG7, also by NDCs. That's also include both technology and also investment analysis to provide how much those agencies, the countries can bear. We already started the pilots in 3 countries, Bangladesh, in Indonesia, and Georgia. And there are more countries engaged, like Fiji in Pacific, and Lao PDR in Southeast Asia, Nepal in South Asia, and also Tajikistan in Central Asia, also Tonga. We're also under the discussion with the other government from Kyrgyzstan and Pakistan, Thailand, and Vietnam. Hopefully by end of this year, we will have a number of national energy roadmap, which will contribute to the government decision making about achieving SDG7, and at the same time to provide these policy recommendations and quantify the analysis about achieving NDCs. So that is exactly the integrated approach. When you just look at the energy sector, when you look at your SDG7. So my conclusion is that the development of the national energy roadmap will have the in-depth analysis and to understand the country's challenges and also to understand the gaps of achieving their NDCs and also the SDG7. But this doesn't mean, this roadmap will replace the existing government and national energy strategy and the plans. So this means that we will provide supplemented kind of information and analysis for the policymakers to integrate this within their existing national energy policies and the planning and the strategy. So the development of this NDC, the SDG7 roadmap will support the implement of the NDCs and also scale up NDCs. I think that's the call for the next COP, to think about what are the measures and policies for the country to scale up their NDCs. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Liu. And thank you for highlighting the challenge of meeting both SDG7 and the commitments made in the NDCs of countries. But you ended on a positive note that you're trying to address the complementarity between the 2 targets and how, finance and technology and investment could play a role in finding that convergence. And as we say, we very much realize that the battle against climate change would be won or lost in the Asia Pacific region. So thank you for setting the scene for us and also showing that there is a possible convergence in moving to a confluence on these 2 targets. Now that we have had the scene setting presentation, let's move on to the second part of our session, which is presentations from 3 different contexts. Let me start with the first speaker in this session, which is Ms. Sana Khan from Pakistan. She is working with the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority of Pakistan and has contributed significantly to the national level mitigation actions in a variety of sectors, including energy, forestry, waste management, and agriculture. Her presentation will be on the opportunities and challenges for mitigation in Pakistan. Sana, you have 8 minutes. We have to catch up on time. So please emphasize your key messages and takeaways in the 8 minutes that you have. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. So I'll quickly start with my presentation. These are the contents of my presentation. First, I would like to give a little bit overview of the country so that it's easier for us to understand the issues we are facing. We are basically situated in Southeast Asia. Our climate is arid to semi-arid. And towards the north, we have mountain ranges, which are among the highest in the world. And as we move towards the south, we observe plateaus and plains. And we are fifth most populous country globally. When we talk about climate change impacts, we are badly hit due to extreme climate events, which are in the form of heat waves, floods, droughts, etc. And we are ranked fifth due to being affected by risks of climate change, although our emissions are very low globally. And it's according to the predictions, by the end of the century, we are expecting 3 to 5 degree increase in our temperature. However, rainfall will not be much variable, and sea level is also expected to rise. Our annual budget in order to deal with these climate-related issue is 8.4% of the total budget. And when we look at the different sectors, energy sector is the highest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, followed by agriculture. And the 2030 projections are also showing the same results. However, we can also observe that the other sectors like industry, land use, change and forestry are also going to increase their emissions. And from 2015, 300% increases observed. When we look at the sectoral consumption of energy, highest consumption is by industry, followed by transport and domestic. Pakistan has a lot of potential to save energy. I've just jotted this one example just to see, like, just by replacing our appliances with efficient ones, there's a lot of potential to save energy. Coming to our perspective on NDCs, our aim is to reduce 20% of the projected 2030 greenhouse gas emissions, and this will cost us around 40 billion US dollars. And this is the cost for mitigation action, while for adaptation needs, the cost will vary between 7 to 14 billion NM. However, to achieve this, the entire implementation of NDCs is under Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan, which operates at national level. And even in the Vision 2025, Pakistan has incorporated climate change and global warming in its long-term plans. In 2012, we have jotted National Climate Change Policy, and in 2013, National Disaster Risk Management Policy. Both provide us with a framework for policy action and goals so that we can mainstream climate change. And in order to follow up these policies, framework for implementation of climate change policy was launched. This framework is also helping to make decisions at national level, and also for the preparation of national adaptation plans and nationally appropriate mitigation actions. Climate change is also incorporated into our public sector development programs. And recently in 2017, we have passed Climate Change Act, which includes Climate Change Council, Climate Change Authority, and Climate Change Fund as 3 instruments. The report that we submitted to UNFCCC is incorporating the greenhouse gas emissions and the projections based on the present and future socioeconomic parameters. However, we have failed to make it clear, like, once we achieve the financial assistance, which action will be the priority. And then we haven't even mentioned any single measurable target to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And additionally, the mitigation options which have been presented are only for energy and agriculture. However, we observe that the other sectors are also going to increase emissions, so they should also appropriate plans should also be made for them. When we talk about NAMAs, Pakistan has submitted 8 NAMAs to the registry, out of which up till now only 2 have been able to gain the required financial support. One is in the phase of getting registered, and 2 are in the planning phase. When we talk about energy, since energy is the highest emitter of greenhouse gas, focusing on just energy efficiency, we can see from this graph that there is huge potential to save energy only by by adopting energy efficiency. Like I mentioned, there are no specific targets in our NDC report. However, National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, in its strategic plan 2025, has jotted down its different plans in its 5 sector, which it plans to implement, and has given certain targets. The overall target is to save 3 MTOE energy by 2025. And in sub sectors also, it has mentioned the targets, like in building sector, it wants to save 0.5 MTOE, in transport 0.5, industry 1.3, agriculture 0.3, and power 0.4. And it has also given some new dimensions in energy efficiency sector, which were missing in the NDC report. So there's a huge opportunity in energy efficiency sector in Pakistan. Now I'll briefly go through the challenges. NAMA is still not clearly understood in Pakistan. It's not being implemented that the way it should have been. And there's 6 NAMAs which have been submitted and still haven't received any financial support. Our first biannual update report has still not been drafted. This is mainly due to the technological constraints and financial constraints. Some other lessons which we learned from NAMA were that we do not have sufficient data available. As a result, our quantitative analysis is not good, and which makes it hard for us to engage with different stakeholders. Industries are still not aware about the new technology, so they are not ready to adopt these new efficient and other green technologies, because they still have some misconceptions. Government engagement in some cases is not sufficient. Sometimes they leave the matter to the other parties so that they can tackle the situation themselves instead of intervening. We have lacks of financial grants, technical assistance, technology development, transfer, and capacity building. And as a result of this, we haven't been able to realize the actual full potential of mitigation in Pakistan. And then a lot of the budget percentage is given to the climate change related activities, and which sometimes is observed as hindrance to the other development projects which could have been adopted that can help in poverty alleviation. And then this challenge has been faced by almost all the successive governments, how to balance this climate change with economic growth and population. And the voluntary nature of NDCs is sometimes a hindrance, like the developed nations are not that, sometimes they cannot, they won't be that serious in transferring their funds because they don't find it obligatory. And then we again have some gaps. Since we have no defined targets, so we don't know what will be the impact on the socio-economic development. Private sector, always thinking about to make profit, is hesitant in Pakistan to participate in these mitigation activities, and the coordination between provinces and the national government is weak. Some opportunities are that we can look at the NAMA as a tool, strengthen it, and use it as a driver to implement our NDCs, and use it further to have sustainable development. We can also invite developed nations to initiate their mitigation projects in our country. And we can have public-private partnership, where private partnership can even help in financing and implementation. We can enhance the carbon sinks and sell excess carbon credits. We need to strengthen the institutional arrangements and involve all the stakeholders, including financing, planning, commissions, everything. And all the stakeholders should be able to get their benefit from any project that we are initiating. Proper research should be done for the financial schemes available. This will help in a proper dialogue with the stakeholders. Professionals can be trained in Pakistan, especially so that they can carry out the data analysis, modeling, etc. Themselves, instead relying on the foreign help. This is usually a constraint. And we need smart allocation of our budget resources for mitigation adaptation measures, so that our sustainable development is not halted. And we should not completely rely on the foreign aid, and should look for opportunities and raise national contributions to support the mitigation efforts.
Yes, please. Thank you. Sure. I think Sana was, in any case, moving towards the conclusion of her presentation, and she has very clearly highlighted the challenges of implementing the NDC in Pakistan. She highlighted not only technological issues, but also technical capacity issues, financing, not only domestic, but also international flows of financing. And finally, issues related to governance, the relationship between the central government and the provinces, and how the implementation of NDCs has to devolve at the lower levels of governance as well. So it's a complicated story that she outlined to us, but there were also some reason to be optimistic about different aspects of governance that are being put into place, including the Climate Change Act, issues related to both disaster risk management and climate change policy being seen in unison. So there are rays of hope, and we would come back to her in the panel discussion to understand better how the challenges are being addressed in Pakistan. So without further ado, let me move on to our next presenter, Mr. Ratin Kukreja, who's the manager for energy in ICF Consulting in India. He has over 10 years of experience working on the ground, I would say, in thermal power plants, with micro and small and medium enterprises, building energy efficiency in these contexts. And his presentation would be focusing on industrial decarbonization, and that being posed as the next challenge. So over to you, Ratin, for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Preeti. And hello, everyone. I'm Ratin Kukreja, and I manage the Energy Efficiency Division at ICF India office. ICF is a global consulting firm with presence in more than 70 countries, and we are proactively working to help challenging problems related to energy efficiency and climate change. I would like to thank Asia Clean Energy Forum for giving me this opportunity to present my views on this platform in front of this large and knowledgeable audience. To begin with, my presentation today will revolve around why we need to focus on industrial decarbonization, why it is still a challenge, and conclude with a way forward to decarbonize the industrial sector with respect to the Indian context. So beginning with the presentation, as many of us would know, to reduce impacts of climate change, several countries had come together to sign the Paris Agreement, which is now considered a landmark event to combat the rise in global temperature. Now, further, to achieve this goal, every country had then come up with intended nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as we call, for decarbonizing and curbing emissions within their own country. So India is also one of those countries and has plans to reduce its emission intensity by 35% by 2030 with respect to the 2005 levels. And for that, decarbonization has a pivotal role to play. So the question that arises now is, why focus specifically on industrial decarbonization? Well, over the last few years, the decarbonization pathways have emerged for sectors such as transport, power, and buildings, and these have been driven by technological breakthroughs and cost reduction. For example, in the transport sector, we have electric vehicles emerging as a future technology. In power, we already have renewables, which have made a significant contribution, especially in electricity generation. And in buildings, electricity is the mainstay. So we can very easily assess that decarbonizing these sectors is not going to be much of a challenge in future. Whereas when we talk about the industrial sectors, such pathways are not well defined, and this is due to a number of challenges. So let's see what these challenges are. So I'll take help of a very small example to elaborate on these challenges. Let's consider a cement manufacturing plant. So we have operating temperatures in the range of 1500 degrees Celsius in kilns in cement plants, which is generally achieved by burning of carbon fuels. So theoretically speaking, I can say that electricity can produce this heat, but it can be very complex and very costly, and it may require significant changes to the design of the furnaces to achieve such high temperatures. And such high temperatures also cannot be reached by the renewable technologies. Also, the processes in industries are highly integrated and interconnected with each other. Therefore, if I have to electrify a process heat in a plant, we will need to make these changes in original fuel supply system, its source, its evacuation. We'll need a retrofit in the busbar system, the transformers. So basically, we can say that wholesome changes will be required. And similarly, when we talk about emissions in a cement plant, almost half of the emissions come from the calcination of limestone to produce clinker, which is then further used as a feedstock for manufacturing cement. So during this process, a large amount of CO2 is released. So it's very clear that emissions from processes like calcination can't be simply reduced by changing the fuel. We basically need to find innovative methods to modify these processes to reduce emissions. It cannot be done simply by replacement of fuel. Also for industries, the lifetime is somewhere around 30 years and sometimes it is even more than that. And with large installed capacity base, this means changing processes will be done to a significant extent in existing facilities. And this will again require costly rebuilds and retrofits. And these retrofits will actually lead to increase in manufacturing cost, and which will actually make these commodities less competitive in the market. So coming down to the Indian scenario now. So in India, the industrial sector is second next to power in terms of energy consumption, and being a developing nation, it's well known that industrialization activities are expected to surge in coming years. Therefore, industrial sector will definitely play an important role in achieving NDC targets, and statistics reveal that electricity is going to be the game changer here. So in order to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, share of electricity in India's industrial energy mix by 2050 is expected to increase to 54% as compared to the 29% under BAU scenario, business as usual scenario. So hence the link between industry sector and power sector also will play an important role. Moving to sector-wise industrial emissions, in this slide we can see how India's industrial emissions are primarily dominated by 4 major industry segments: iron and steel, non-metallic minerals, chemicals, and refineries. And these industries contribute nearly 3/4 of the total emissions. And this is because they are hard to abate sectors having high feedstock emissions and process heat requirements. India as such has a huge decarbonization potential with emissions to the tune of 635 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And this clearly indicates that we need to explore more options towards a journey to deep decarbonization. So here's a SWOT analysis of the Indian industrial sector with respect to decarbonization. When we talk about strengths, India's industrial segment comprises of well-developed private and public sector. We have large companies capable of making investments on workable technologies and compete globally. On weaknesses, the biggest one right now is a lack of a clear roadmap and policy to foster decarbonization, especially for hard-to-abate sectors, and less policy supports and investment towards R&D since it is a developing country. And so this actually throws up an opportunity to collaborate globally through technology transfer from the developed world. And as I said earlier, there's also a huge opportunity in terms of potential for decarbonization, as most of the market is still untapped. As for the threats, India's industrial sector has a substantial share of unorganized sector, that is presence of small and medium scale industries, where investment towards even energy efficiency activities hasn't reached to the peak levels. So moving on to the technologies now. Well, there are a few technology options to decarbonize the industrial sector, some of which are well known and already under implementation, such as energy efficiencies, their renewables, demand side management, and even biomass has been started to use, but as a fuel. Although some of the technology options have matured, some are still in development stage. So we can see from this slide, which represents a technological readiness level of different technologies. The readiness level for technologies such as carbon capture, usage and storage, CCUS, electrification of heat, use of hydrogen, or other novel technologies or innovative technologies are not yet fully commercial and cost effective. So it's important for now that as these technologies are developing further, efforts should continue in areas of energy efficiency, demand side management, and circular economy, so that we at least for now keep on progressing on our path towards decarbonization. So how do we move forward now? Well, here are 5 most important actionable points that I have mentioned. My first recommendation is to develop a comprehensive vision and blueprint for a circular economy, which can actually go a long way in improving fuel and raw material security for a developing country like India, where very less stress has been given to recycling and reuse of waste from industries. It is also equally important to develop mechanisms to ensure technology transfer happens from the developed world through global funding. Thirdly, I would say sector-specific roadmaps with specific accountability for hard-to-abate sectors needs to be prepared on priority. Next, there's also need to develop a deeper carbon finance market so that decarbonization technologies can be scaled up and promoted and be deployed. Finally, as a last point, I would say that there's a need to create awareness, because everyone speaks about other sectors and industrial decarbonization is less discussed. So there's a need to create awareness, create a dialogue, and it's imperative that a call to action is generated for all stakeholders to come together and work towards decarbonizing this sector. So these are the 5 most important actionable points that I feel are important to move forward and decarbonize the industrial sector. Thanks everyone for hearing me out patiently, and I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ratin, for your presentation, and thank you for highlighting the scope for reducing emissions in the industrial sector, and also, you know, your last slide, which is talking about not only technology roadmaps but also looking at other avenues such as carbon financing, carbon markets, and also the call to action, you know, the readiness of the industrial sector in India to go for such call to actions is maybe something we can pick up in the panel later on. But thank you for your presentation, and let me move on to the next presenter, which is His Excellency John Merton, who is the envoy for the UN Convention on Climate Change next conference, COP26, which is scheduled to be held in the UK. He has been leading the UK's government's climate diplomacy related to generating action and ambition in 2020 for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And he has played various roles. He has been Her Majesty's ambassador to various countries and has worked in different capacities. So over to you, Mr. Merton, for your presentation on the road to net zero in the context of a resilient economy. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry? Lovely. Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the chance to speak today to everyone at the Clean Energy Forum. My role involves trying to coordinate all of the UK's diplomatic activities in support of a successful COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021. And that involves a lot of travel, which obviously is more difficult at the moment. And it involves really trying to push ambition in all senses of the word through the Paris Agreement that was struck 5 years ago. And that means ambition in terms of mitigating our emissions. That means ambition in terms of raising climate finance. And that means ambition in terms of adaptation and resilience. And we're pushing that ambition through the framework of 5 campaigns ahead of COP26. Campaigns about adaptation and resilience and helping countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change and become more resilient in the face of it. A campaign around nature-based solutions, because by conserving nature and working with nature, we can reduce a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions. And there are strong ties between the 15th Conference on Biological Diversity, which will be hosted in Kunming next year in China, and COP26, and we hope to exploit those. A campaign about the transition to renewable energy, away from coal and gas and other fossil fuels towards renewable energy, and highlighting the pace at which that transition can take place. A campaign about shifting to zero emission vehicles, because transport, particularly in the industrialized nations, is an ever-growing component of our emissions, and we must tackle that if we're to get towards net zero. And then finally, a campaign that stitches all these together about finance, which is being led by the former governor of our central bank, Mark Carney, hoping to influence financial decision makers in industry, in banks, in central financial institutions like the ADB, in order to make sure that portfolios shift and decision makers in the financial world take account of climate change in their decision making, and that will have profound consequences. All of which is geared to try and encourage countries to see that actually it can be easier to set ambitious NDCs in the context of the Paris Agreement and ambitious long-term strategies. Sorry, I'm at home, I'm working from home on account of lockdown, and I've got children coming in from home. That's why I've got a screen up behind me. Let me move on in my presentation just to say, although we're doing all of that in the context of COP26, we're looking today just to focus a little bit about long-term strategies and how we can all work towards net zero, and why a long-term strategy is a good idea. Excuse me, I'm just going to shut my door because my children have just come in. I'm just going to shut my door.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry, it's the perils of working at home during lockdown. Excuse me. So why net zero? Why would the UK be encouraging countries to take on net zero targets as part of our COP26 campaign? Well, firstly, the Paris Agreement makes very clear that we have to bring global greenhouse gas emissions into balance with sinks in the second half of the 20th century if we're to stand any hope of achieving the target of limiting the rise in global temperatures to 2 degrees centigrade. So it's written into the Paris Agreement that we've all signed up to. But importantly, in terms of helping industry to deliver net zero and to help the private sector economy deliver net zero, setting a long-term target gives businesses real certainty for their long-term planning. And anyone who works in industry will tell you that they can work with any regulatory framework as long as they have certainty. And the thing that challenges industry the most is continual changes in the business regulatory framework. So long-term targets give business certainty, and they give investors confidence that the regulatory framework will be stable and they can work within it. And secondly, additionally, there are huge additional benefits to public health from reducing emissions. And this was one of the origins of the UK's journey on long-term emissions reduction, that we had a very influential report called the Stern Review that showed that even though at the time of the Stern Review, renewable energy technologies were not necessarily cost competitive on their own right, when you looked at the economy as a whole, you could see that the emissions reductions would actually bring savings to the economy because, for example, falls in particulate pollution levels would improve public health. And we've seen this very much across Asia during the lockdown with COVID, where you've seen pollution levels falling in big cities like Delhi. And as a consequence, there have been improvements in public health. And then finally, and more importantly, as we look to the future, the UK government is of the view that actually the growing sectors of the global economy are the green sectors. And that therefore, the old days, we had a trade-off between economic growth and reducing your emissions. And if you wanted to reduce your emissions, you had to accept slightly lower economic growth. But we've seen such fantastic changes in the renewable technology scene over the last few years that actually now we're increasingly of the view that if you want to grow your economy, you need to green your economy. So let me carry on and give a little bit of evidence for that. Over the last 30 years, this chart shows how the UK, amongst the G7 group of industrialized Western economies, has reduced its emissions by more than any other G7 member. Actually, the emissions reductions there are 42%, but if you take in last year's figures into account, it's now 45% emissions reductions in the UK since 1990. So our emissions have almost halved. And at the same time, our economy has grown faster than the G7 average, which shows that actually it's quite possible to reduce your emissions swiftly, indeed much more swiftly than your competitors, and still grow your economy, which should hopefully give people a reason for encouragement. And one of the reasons why I think that trend is said to continue is because of the massively and rapidly falling costs of renewables, which are increasingly following Wright's law in the terms of the cost of the renewables is declining in proportion to the scale at which they're being manufactured and deployed. And now in many countries around the world, renewables like solar and wind are the cheapest source of power if you're building power from new sources. And increasingly, by 2030, they will undercut coal and gas everywhere in the world, and probably sooner than that. And indeed, as I've just mentioned, they're leading to massive employment creation in this new and growing sector. And there's lots of research out there to suggest that renewable energy and investment in renewable energy creates more employment than investments in capital intensive but not labor intensive extraction of fossil fuels. So they're good for the economy and they're good for employment. And the figures on the right are from Bloomberg that show just how fast the costs of renewable energy have been falling in recent years. And that, I think, will lead suddenly to, in the near future, to a very swift uptake in how fast it's being put into place. This is another way of portraying the same figures. If you go back to 2014, you'll see that the cheapest energies sourced by country sort of displayed here on the chart. And you see that in 2014, if you look in the left-hand column, the UK saw that coal was the cheapest source of power. And you only have to go back 2 years before 2014 to 2012, so 8 short years ago, and coal was the largest source of electricity generation in the UK. So it produced more than 40% of our power in UK from coal in 2012. For the last 66 days, the UK has not used any coal in producing electricity. So in 8 short years, we've gone from 40% of our power generation to 0%. Now, I know that trend has been accelerated by COVID-19 and the impact of that upon our economy, but we have a policy commitment to phase out coal in our mix entirely by 2024. So certainly in less than 12 years, we'd have gone from 40% of our power mix to 0. And I use that as an encouragement for many of the countries in Southeast Asia where coal remains an important part of the mix, just to show how quickly you can move away from coal in due course. And consequently, as we move across the graph, you can see that come 2019, the cheapest form of generation now in the UK is wind. And that's onshore wind in the case of the UK, but increasingly now our offshore wind is competitive, and we have more offshore wind than any other country in the world. And we're bidding in offshore wind contracts for less than the price of gas now in the UK. So we switched from coal to gas in our power sources, and we're increasingly switching from gas to renewables. And so I encourage people that actually, as we look to the future in 2024, for example, in many of the countries in Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and so on, that are cited as still having coal as their cheapest power source, maybe by 2024, that would have changed. And of course, the more you invest in your renewable sector in a country, the more you get economies from the supply chain that feed into further reducing the cost of generation. And so you hit a virtuous cycle, as we're beginning to enjoy now in the UK. All this feeds into how we intend to reach net zero in the UK. We have our target set in law to hit net zero by 2050. We were the first major industrialized economy to set that into law, and we passed that almost with a unanimous vote in our Houses of Parliament. Our friends in Scotland, who are part of the United Kingdom, always like to go one better than the English and the Welsh, so they've set their target for 2045, and that's the sort of healthy competition that we want to encourage in the Paris process, because the government of Scotland has seen that it's actually probably in its economic interest to move faster than the rest of the United Kingdom in the hope of attracting new investment in the renewable sector. As I say, we have a plan to phase out coal by 2024, although the market trends suggest that actually we will be moving faster than that. We've got it in law now that we will phase out the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2040. We're consulting on bringing that forward certainly to 2035 and probably even earlier than 2035 as part of the green stimulus packages that the government may be set to announce in due course. And we have a plan to decarbonize transport, which is the major growing part of the part of our economy where emissions continue to grow, including support for ultra-low emission vehicles infrastructure and government support to put in place the infrastructure to enable the rapid rollout of zero emission vehicles. And through our contributions in terms of international climate finance, and our Prime Minister announced in New York last year how we were doubling our international climate finance to over £11.6 billion for the next 5 years, which is our share of international climate finance. Through our ICF provision, we've supported net zero planning calculators and their use in Asian markets. And I highlight in particular the work that we've done with Indonesia and the planning ministry, where we've worked with WRI and others to support planning to show what would be the growth figures in different carbon routes for the Indonesian economy. A high carbon route, which sort of is in line with business as usual, a medium route and a low carbon route. And what that modeling has shown is that for the Indonesian economy, if they adopt a low carbon route and adopt a lot of measures to reduce the use of carbon in their economy, actually that produces the highest economic growth outcomes of all the three routes, not the lowest. So it's very, we're at a phase where kind of traditional wisdom about the economic impact of adopting low carbon technology is really changing. And this is happening really now in the private sector as well. And institutional investors, and this is related to our finance campaign for COP26, institutional investors are really beginning to send signals to the market. And I've highlighted BlackRock, which is the largest private institutional investor in the world. And earlier this year, the chair of BlackRock wrote to companies explaining that he expected those companies in which BlackRock was investing to take account of climate change in their accounting and reporting. And that's leading, that sort of shareholder pressure is leading to many companies, not just consumer-facing companies like Nestle, but also steel manufacturers like ThyssenKrupp and oil majors like BP to adopt net zero targets that are Paris compliant and map forward a pathway to get to net zero in their own emissions by 2050. So the private sector is beginning to realize that actually if it wants to sustain itself and if it wants to be competitive into the future, it has to be embracing net zero as a concept. And more companies are working in this direction. And we are working through Mark Carney and the team that we have on finance to make sure that increasingly these companies reflect net zero assumptions in their accounts. So if you look at the accounts of many of the US and other oil majors, you'll see that some of them reflect price assumptions about the future cost of oil that are not Paris compliant. And we're working to try and ensure that more and more companies adopt accounting measures that are in line with what it would mean to achieve our Paris pathways. And this message is really being received because companies are aware that actually if they don't adjust and change, it affects the future viability of the companies. If we look forward, 2050 is 30 years away. And it's difficult to imagine now how fast the world will have changed in 30 years. Because if we look back 30 years, the highest value companies in the world by stock exchange value were Ford, GM, and ExxonMobil. And now the highest value companies are Alphabet, Microsoft, and Apple, companies that were barely even heard of back in 1990. So we can only guess we can only guess what will be the most valuable companies come 2050. And I've highlighted Tesla on the right-hand side. We all know about the growth of Tesla. Fewer people in Asia may know about Nikola, which is a US vehicle manufacturer who's enjoyed a spectacular stock market debut over recent weeks and now has a value greater than Ford. And it has yet to produce a vehicle. So Ford, which was the most valuable company in the world along with GM back in 1990, has been overtaken in stock market value in 2020 by a vehicle company that has yet to make a single vehicle. And one of the reasons for that is stock markets price in the future. And they can see that the growth in the vehicle sector as a result of legislation like the UK's on zero emission vehicles is in the zero emission vehicle sector. So markets are now beginning to channel money into zero emission vehicle production in a really exciting way. And what that means is investors have to catch that wave, because if they don't, they risk investing in things that become stranded assets. And if you look at a stock market chart of the value of the major oil firms over the last 20 years, you'll see many oil firms have seen their stock market values tread water at best, because actually investment is going into other sectors. And so that's why companies like BP have adopted net zero targets and are trying to transition themselves into becoming energy companies more widely. I just want to conclude by showing this slide, which I think is optimistic about the pace of the pace of change that we can anticipate, because it's easy to be pessimistic in the when confronted with the science of climate change. And I believe that we're really at the foot of an S curve of technology adaptation. And this slide was a photograph that many of you may have seen and has been used quite widely of a parade in New York City in 1905, the Easter Day Parade. And in that slide, there is actually a car. All the other carriages are horse-drawn, but there is one car, which I think is highlighted there. One car on a busy street full of horses in 1905. But then at the same parade, just 8 years later, the game is reversed, and the game is now no longer spot the car, but spot the horse. And there is one horse in that picture, but it's actually very difficult to see. And that just shows that in 8 short years, the car completely supplanted the horse. And we've seen that again more recently with the mobile phone. And I've spent half my career working in Africa. And 20 years ago, you would have had to wait 8 years for a telephone in Kenya. And now there are more phones than people in Kenya. And I think that same sort of technological transformation is about to expand into the renewable sector. And that has huge implications for climate change, but also for access to energy. And many countries, many of the most poorest countries in the world, where communities are not even reached by transmission grids, and you spoke about half of the investment from the ADB going into transmission grids, renewables can bypass the need for a grid completely. Distributed renewables like solar, you can go straight into a community, you don't even need a grid. So I think we're about to see really rapid uptake. All of which brings us back to why a green recovery is so important to net zero. Countries around the world are putting lots of stimulus money forward to get their economies going again after COVID-19. And it's really important that we use that stimulus money wisely and shape it towards pursuing our climate goals. Because if we don't take this opportunity, if we support the construction of coal-fired power stations around the world, we will bake in emissions for years to come, and we will miss our Paris targets. Whereas conversely, and we would saddle ourselves with generation that will not be economic even in a few years' time. Conversely, if we use it to advance the renewable sector and put ourselves on that trajectory to net zero, we will stimulate our economies in a way that will also be compatible with climate action. And increasingly, it will be supportive of our economies. And I've spoken about the modeling we've done in Indonesia and other countries that shows that the low carbon growth pathway is actually resulting in the highest economic growth. And finally, and increasingly, we'll find that those countries that don't set that net zero framework for their companies and don't set that framework in which they can prosper, will find that they're outcompeted. And when I've gone around countries in industrialized Northeast Asia, and I've talked about the uptake of renewables, some policymakers have spoken to me and they said, well, it's very expensive. Renewable technology is expensive in our context. But I think it's going to increasingly be like a mobile phone. 20 years ago, many of us couldn't afford mobile phones. And now we're in the situation where many of us can't afford not to. And if you're in, say, Seoul in Korea or Japan, and you've got wholesale electricity prices of, say, 12 US cents a kilowatt hour, the challenge is how will you compete with energy intensive industries in, say, India, that's putting in solar energy at 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour? How will your energy intensive industries compete unless you make that transition to renewable energy as part of a transition towards a net zero economy? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Merton, for a very upbeat message talking about transitions and transformations and how UK is leading it by doing it at home, as well as the narrative that you're building around that development, economic growth, and deep decarbonization are compatible with each other, and that we have to build these virtuous cycles, as you called it, moving forward in our transition to low carbon and resilient pathways. So thank you so much for your time. And I know we have gone a little beyond in our allocation, but in your role as the COP26 envoy, to encourage and enthuse us on the art of possible. Thank you for making this presentation. Now let's quickly move on to the panel. I know we have been receiving questions from the audience, and I have been taking note of those questions. Some of those could be addressed in the question as well. So our first panelist is Brian. I think somebody has their microphone not muted. If you could please mute it. Okay. Okay. It's better now. So Brian Eels is a climate change law and policy specialist, and currently she is helping edit a book on climate litigation in the Asia and the Pacific. And having listened to these presentations, Bryony, how do you think that the legal and regulatory frameworks are evolving in the countries that you have been working with to address climate change? Bryony, over to you.
Thanks so much, Preeti. Just a little introduction. As Preeti mentioned, I've been working on climate law, policy and litigation, specifically in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific in developing member countries. And we have done a pretty in-depth review of the legal and policy frameworks as well as litigation. Within the legal and policy frameworks, what we're seeing is that most countries still implement their climate action through a combination of policy frameworks and existing laws. And that clearly has benefits for it's much faster to do that kind of implementation. So you can quickly prepare a policy and then you can easily update an existing law. In contrast, we are increasingly seeing countries pass framework or umbrella laws. So there are significant benefits to these kinds of laws, and I just thought it would be useful to run through them. So I think we can all agree that in the climate change context, we need everyone to be on board. And so what that means from a government's perspective is that we need the climate action to be driven from the top down. We need cohesive, collaborative, and cooperative frameworks. And a very good way to do that is to ensure that your institutional frameworks are in order. So we need to ensure that different government ministries can share data, that they can talk to each other. Climate change is really an issue that we need to rely on data to move forward. So if different ministries can share data and report to each other, that is critical. Over the next 5 years, as the Paris Agreement transitions into implementation, countries will start seeing their reporting requirements changing. So the Paris Agreement's enhanced transparency framework will require that reporting. Unless countries have an institutional framework that allows them to collect data and understand their baseline and report those levels, the reporting will be difficult. And it will be also difficult for countries to increase their ambition under the Paris Agreement's mechanism. I also thought it would be worthwhile just addressing 2 other points. The other thing that we've noticed in regulatory frameworks is there is still an emphasis, even in Asia and the Pacific, on mitigation action. So particularly within the energy sector, of course, it's very important to focus on energy emission reduction, but we need to start looking at how do we make these sectors more resilient. So there's still a lag and there's still catch up that needs to happen to ensure greater resilience, including within the energy sector, because we need to be looking forward, and this is the benefit of long-term climate change strategies, to understand how climate will impact infrastructure. The third point is that we are starting to see courts take a more active role in climate governance. So courts have traditionally kept away from policy because it's seen to be interfering with a separation of powers. But we are seeing litigants being more active and courts being more active and relying on rights. So human rights, constitutional rights, existing legal and policy rights. So a great case is Uganda. It's a very famous Dutch case out of the Netherlands, where the Supreme Court of the Netherlands said, look, the government has signed the Paris Agreement, and that's a scientific-based agreement. There's scientific consensus about what we need to do to reach 2 degrees. We as a court also have an obligation to protect rights within the Netherlands. So there's the European human rights, I'm trying to say constitutional framework, but it's not. Nevertheless, the court said, look, we have to protect these rights. And so we dismiss the government's argument that we can't get involved in policy. The court also said, look, GHG reductions are no longer in it's no longer in the domain of politics only. We are seeing similar litigation all across Asia. Pakistan has a very famous case of a farmer suing the government, saying, look, you've signed the Paris Agreement. There is a climate change policy. The government has also passed a climate change policy implementation framework, and neither of those are being implemented. The government's failure to implement those policy documents is undermining my constitutional right to life, my right to dignity, my right to water. And the court agreed. So this allows courts in Asia to get involved when they can base it on a constitutional right. And the court ordered the government, actually created a climate change commission. It required that climate change commission to report regularly, and the commission had to report on progress achieving policy outcomes. Nepal, similar issue arose, some suit against the government to say climate change is an existential threat. The government has a climate change policy, but it hasn't passed a climate change law. The government has signed the Paris Agreement and it has international policy commitments. And the Supreme Court of Nepal agreed and ordered the government to pass a climate change law. I'll quickly move on to another case from Pakistan, but it's relevant in the energy context because 5 women are currently suing the government in Pakistan. The basis of their case is, again, the government has signed the Paris Agreement, it has a policy. Also, the government has submitted or communicated its nationally determined contributions. Under that document, the government committed to reductions, so emission reductions. So what the plaintiffs have said is, even though you've made these reductions, what's important is to ensure that energy is a core component of achieving emission reductions. So even though you've made these commitments, since December 2017, the government has not passed or approved one clean energy project. So what they're arguing is that the government's failure to take action to enable clean energy projects within Pakistan is undermining its international commitments and its commitments under the NDC. So I think some of the key points that it's worth highlighting is that we are in a post-COVID-19 environment, and we are trying to figure out how is it that we can use this time, this pause. It is worthwhile looking at legal and regulatory frameworks. Do they allow data sharing? Do they allow green finance to come in? Do they allow climate action to be cohesive? And it's only through this collective effort that we can achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we should also be aware that courts and citizens will increasingly ask the governments to step up, to do their share, and to ensure that they meet the commitments and goals of the Paris Agreement. Thanks, Preeti.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryony, and thank you for highlighting not only citizens' action, which we have seen various movements, springing up in the last couple of years, young people also, taking to the streets. So the more and more, the citizens wake up and not only call upon their governments to take action, but also, we within our individual spheres, whatever we can do to help mitigate the situation. I think it comes back to individual action as well as a collective. So thank you for highlighting a very different perspective on this panel. And let me now move on to the last speaker, last but not the least, my very dear friend Agus Sari, who is the CEO of Landscape Indonesia. And he has been also the Deputy Minister for Red Plus Management Agency in Indonesia, and also chairs the President's Task Force on Red Plus Finance. And Agus, you have heard several references to Indonesia from Mr. Merton, from Mr. Liu, and all the progressive things that are happening. So over to you to highlight, what are the key issues or key takeaways from Indonesia's experience in implementing its NDC. Agus?
Yes, thank you very much, Preeti. It's really an honor to be on this distinguished panel. Just to first restate what I've always restated every time I've been asked this, is that the NDCs are not enough globally. We need a lot more ambition to achieve its Paris Agreement's objective. We probably need 2 to 3 more Paris Agreements to be able to keep the increase in of our temperature not more than 2 degrees and even closer to 1.5 degrees. There are 2 large sectors when we are talking about NDCs, the energy and industrial sectors, and then the land-based sectors, the agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors. Let me start with the good news first, of course. There's this LOI, the letter of intent with the government of Norway, that sets an REDD plus partnership between the 2 countries, Norway and Indonesia. And just recently, marking the 10 years anniversary of its LOI, Indonesia is going to receive $56 million payment for its performance in reducing deforestation and, of course, its emissions. And that's only for the 2016 performance. We'll still be waiting for the 2017 and on. And actually, already performance is showing that Indonesia has reduced quite considerably from then on, 60% by 2017 and
40% more by 2018. So Indonesia is basically in a very a certain path towards meeting its land-based NDC. That is very, very good to announce. The bad news, of course, is in the energy sector somehow. Indonesia has a very ambitious target, well, ambitious from Indonesia's perspective, of 23% renewable energy mix in its final energy mix by 2025 in 5 years, and 31% by 2050. We may be able to achieve it by 2050, even earlier, but we are at risk of not meeting our own target by 2025. Otherwise, we'll have to actually more than double the portion of our renewable energy supply, which a lot of people say that it may not happen. And a number of things, of course, is a reason. Are the reasons why Indonesia's not doing as well. One is, of course, the continued dominance of coal. I've seen a graph earlier that Indonesia continues to basically use coal because it is still the cheapest source of electricity in Indonesia. Indonesia has its own abundant coal reserves, and actually Indonesia, even until today, still the largest exporter of coal. So that, however, is probably going to change. There is a new regulation by the president to put together a much better feed-in tariff policy for renewable, and also a much more ambitious renewable energy action plan. And in fact, if we are talking about the finance or the economics of renewable, I've installed a solar panel myself on top of my roof. And actually, the electricity from my roof is cheaper than the electricity from the grid. So that is showing a good sign. I think the revolution is quite silent that way. Also, I think another one is the use of market. Indonesia probably started exercising market mechanism through the CDM long time ago under the Kyoto Protocol, and it is preparing itself for a new kinds of market mechanism under the Paris Agreement, under Article 6, under CORSIA for airplanes and other mechanisms, including voluntary. And it is actually in a process of drafting a presidential regulation on how to use market for both domestic and international purposes. I've seen the draft, and it actually is looking good, to be perfectly honest. It is not perfect yet. It is going to have to be finalized, and it probably is going to be finalized soon, but it is looking good. And the last one is that presidential regulation is called carbon economy regulation, which I like a lot, because it doesn't only talk about emissions reduction. It doesn't only talk about putting price on carbon. It doesn't even talk only about carbon market mechanism. It talks about carbon economy, how the economy can and need to be more and more decarbonized. And that is exactly what I think the country needs. It is no longer a tug of war between the environment and the economy. And a new study actually shows that poverty reduction actually has a positive impact on reducing deforestation. Thank you, Priti.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Argus, for covering such a vast country and the the array of initiatives that Indonesia is taking in such a short time. I'm really sorry that we have run a little over our time, but rather than having the panel discussion around the questions we had earlier talked about, there are some very interesting questions which has come from the audience, and due fairness to the audience, let me pose these questions, and I have distributed them across the panel. And if I could start with Sana, and Sana, I understand you had got disconnected in between. There is a question, which is of course lauding the establishment of the Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan. But from your presentation, this particular colleague is asking, what are the challenges, in policy coherence and institutional arrangements in Pakistan? So if you could quickly highlight one or two challenges in this arena of policy coherence and institutional arrangements. Sana, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the question. Firstly, I would like to say that in terms of policy, Pakistan is very committed. Like I mentioned, we have a disaster risk management policy, climate change policy, even a framework to follow it up. And recently we have a climate change act. The problem comes in the implementation. And another major issue is the finances. If I give the example of this Climate Change Act, under this act, we are supposed to have a climate change authority, which will have a vast range of professionals and skilled people. So the problem arises when we are not able to give them good salaries, we can't hire people, and when we can't hire people, we can't work. This issue we have even faced after the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act. We have our authority, but we are not able to hire enough professionals so that we can do the work more smoothly. So we rely on consultancy and international consultancy, etc. So this is another problem, that we don't have skilled professionals. And another problem is after the 18th Amendment, our provinces have powers to make their own set of policies depending on their national provincial circumstances. So sometimes there is issues related to coordination among all these departments. And another important issue, which I believe, is that having all these departments like energy efficiency, environmental protection agency, different authorities, still there is overlapping between these departments, which creates some hurdles when dealing with business affairs. So this needs to be tackled and traced. So I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did, and you very rightly pointed out to issues related to coordination, capacity, and skills, which are very, very essential if a country has to move towards implementation. Thank you. The second question relates to the standards followed by transnational corporations, and I don't know, Ratin, if I'm putting you on the spot. I know you did talk about call for action from industrial sector, but in India, are you seeing that the transnational corporations or multinationals are following the same technical specifications and the highest best available technology is being deployed in their operations in India, or if you have experience from any other country, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Preeti. So I would say in India, yes, we have brands outside from India who have their manufacturing facilities set up, but they are also like binding upon the legal regulations and the industry bylaws. So they also have to kind of follow that. And yes, like every manufacturing facility would like to make their products more sustainable, more competitive, and more greener. Obviously, we need to create a market to ensure that trading of these greener products also takes place. But yes, in India, no matter if what the company background is, from which country, they have to follow the regulations that are there. And yes, they'll have to follow the sustainability practices to ensure that the products are greener. And yes, cost competitive is the most important scenario.
Okay, thank you. The last question, John, apart from this question, I'd also request you to highlight UK, how it is going to ensure that the ambition bandwagon, continues to move during this year. But the question to you was from the audience that, there are many geoengineering solutions that are being introduced, and there are questions related to their viability and safety. And as COP26 host, how does geoengineering solutions enter your design? Over to you, John.
Thanks. By geoengineering, difficult to say in the morning, I think that the questioner is asking about large scale efforts to extract carbon from the atmosphere. I think the important thing as we look forward to COP26 is we don't need technology that has not been proven in order to meet our Paris goals. I mean, large scale geoengineering efforts to extract carbon from the atmosphere are fine and may have a role in the future. But I think what's important to underline, and this relates back to your question about how we will push ambition forward, is all the technology we need to achieve a Paris pathway is already out there, and it's already proven, and it's already at scale. Our Indonesian colleague just told us how the electricity he gets from his rooftop panels are cheaper than the electricity that's there on the grid in Indonesia. So it's not a technological solution that we need. It's a political and a regulatory solution. And what we're seeing is, even in markets, if you take the US, where the US are on the point of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, nevertheless, despite that, because they have a competitive energy market, many of the generating companies in the US are abandoning coal generation and switching to wind and solar because it's cheaper in a competitive market. Conversely, in some countries that are still party to the Paris Agreement, where they have no competition in their electricity market, so you have a single state utility that's dominating production, you're not seeing progress in that way. So we don't need a technological solution. The technology is out there and it's progressing very well. And solar can now deliver. The United Arab Emirates has just put on solar plants that are delivering power at 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's cheaper than the marginal cost of operating a coal-fired power station. That means it's cheaper to build a new solar plant using that technology than it is to shovel coal into an existing fossil fuel power station. So the technology is there. What we need to see is a regulatory environment that sends the signals to the market to adopt that technology. And that's why we are urging long-term targets, because if you give that regulatory certainty to investors, investors don't really mind whether they invest in coal or gas or pixie dust. What they want to do is invest in something that's profitable, and they need to have that regulatory certainty to enable them to make those choices. And that's why long-term targets are so important in driving ambition. And once you have a long-term target in place, suddenly you see that actually it becomes easier and quicker to achieve your targets than you might have thought. And I point you to the example of Germany, which has got its phase-out plans for coal. And what's happening is actually coal use in Germany is dropping off much faster than the phase-out plan, which will leave policymakers with an interesting set of questions. So geoengineering, yes, some of these technological solutions might be really important towards the second half of the 20th century as we try and go to a carbon negative world. But let's not let any doubts about that put us off driving forward with the technology that we have now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everybody for staying over time, and thanks to our audience as well. I believe we have over 450 viewers online still, trudging along with us. I will not do the task of summarizing the rich discussion that we have had during this session, but there are certain takeaway phrases that I'd like to leave with the audience. These phrases, of course, relate to the compatibility between SDG 7 on energies and NDCs, the virtuous cycle for transformation that we all have to launch ourselves into, the role of private sector and institutional investors in taking action, and not forgetting the role of citizens in taking action, and for developing countries, the importance of capacity and skills. And finally, not forgetting the role of the carbon economy. As one of the speakers said it, the role of markets is a subset of that, and as is carbon pricing. But there are different actors that have to push the juggernaut in the right direction, and it is possible to make that change. So on that positive note, thank you so much to our panelists and also to the audience for engaging with us in this important session of the Asia Clean Energy Forum. And on our part, on the part of Asian Development Bank, I'll just end by saying that we are committed to climate action, and as part of our strategy 2030, we have made a commitment that by 2030, 75% of our operations would include climate mitigation and adaptation, and cumulatively between 2019 and 2030, we are committed to providing at least 80 billion in climate financing. So that is our commitment as a multilateral development bank in moving this ambition forward. Thank you all. Thanks for your time, and thanks for your very interesting engagement in this session. Bye-bye.